In our last mini lecture, we took a look at a corporation's organizational chart, and we drew a line between the owners of the corporation, who are the stockholders, and then those that are employed to act on behalf of those owners. We call them managers. Well, those two parties are often in conflict with each other in that managers are human beings and they're naturally inclined to act in their own best interests, which isn't always in the best interests of the stockholders. So hence we have something called the agency problem. And if you've taken business law, you've talked about principal and agents. In this case, the stockholders are the principals. The managers are the agents. They've been hired to act on behalf of the principals. In other words, they make decisions on behalf of the principal. But sometimes they act in their own best interests, which is not always in the best interests of the stockholder. In other words, they're making decisions that don't always maximize the firm's stock price over the long haul. So, how are we going to get these managers in line to make decisions that increase the firm's stock price over the long haul? Well, there are many ways to affect managerial behavior. In other words, ways to keep them in line, to make sure that those decision makers are making decisions that maximize the firm's stock price over the long term. So here's a list of different methods. The first, managerial compensation packages. That is by far the most effective way to manage stockholder-manager conflicts by tying the manager's compensation to the long-run price of the stock. So if that manager makes decisions that make the firm's stock price go up over time, over the long run, well, then that manager will receive a hefty compensation package. Otherwise, their compensation will be puny. Another method is direct intervention by shareholders. Big investors in a corporation can force this because they have the votes. They can take control of that firm. The threat of firing, of course, can also alleviate the agency problem. And finally, the threat of a takeover. If the decisions by the manager are bad, that means that that stock is probably trading low, and investors can come in and scoop up a big block of stock and take over the firm. But again, the best way to ensure that managers are making decisions that maximize shareholder wealth over the long run is to tie their compensation to the long run price of the stock. We also have conflicts between stockholders and debt holders. So the stockholders, again, are the owners of the firm. Debt holders are lenders. Now, before we discuss this, let's review who has priority claim on a corporation's earnings and assets. Well, the stockholders are last in line. That's why common stock ownership is called a residual form of ownership. That means They stand last in line. They get what's left over, if anything, after other parties are paid. Whereas debt holders or lenders are first in line when it comes to a claim on earnings and assets. And debt holders or lenders usually have a fixed return. So stockholders are more likely to prefer riskier projects because if that project pays off, the stockholders are going to reap the benefits of that risky project. On the other hand, bondholders or debt holders receive fixed payments. They've agreed to a certain return, and that's it. So they aren't interested in taking on more risk than necessary. Bondholders are particularly concerned about the use of additional debt because as an organization borrows more and more money, the more likely it becomes that it won't be able to pay any of it back. So bondholders, how are they going to protect themselves? They're going to do so by adding in certain protective covenants in their bond agreements that will limit the use of additional debt. So it's going to put a cap on how much money can be borrowed. And they're also going to put restraints on what managers can do. In other words, what types of risky projects can they take on? Because the bondholders don't experience any sort of additional return. As a matter of fact, it puts at risk their receiving their fixed return. Chapter 1 finishes off with speaking about balancing shareholder interests and the interests of society. We already know that management's primary goal is to maximize shareholder wealth. In other words, make decisions that cause an increase in the firm's stock price over the long term. But does that mean at all costs? Well, no, it doesn't. Is maximizing shareholder value inconsistent with being socially responsible? No, not at all. Firms that are socially responsible are also maximizing shareholder value because we know that shareholder wealth maximization is a long-run concept. If a firm deviates from this, for instance, if they make a decision that might cause a spike in the firm's stock price by being socially irresponsible, they can't sustain it. So over the long haul, it is best to be socially responsible, to abide by certain codes of conduct and moral behavior, to operate within the guidelines of the law and certain regulations because it will pay off in the end. Stock price will be maximized over the long run. Business ethics. Well, as we were speaking of just a minute ago, ethics is defined as standards of conduct or moral behavior. Business ethics can be thought of as a company's attitude and conduct towards all of its stakeholders. That includes not just its investors or stockholders, but also its employees, customers, community. Because if they don't consider their attitude and their conduct towards the larger community of its stakeholders, then it would be it would impose a wide range of costs on the company. It would find it hard to attract top-notch employees. Its products might be boycotted. It might face additional lawsuits, regulations, and be confronted with all sorts of negative publicity. So eventually that would lead to a reduction in shareholder value. In other words, all of this would cause the firm's stock price to go down. And we know that that flies in the face of what we learned in the earlier parts of chapter 1. Certainly, you can think of certain incidences of where maybe a business organization may have been within the legal constraints of certain regulations, but their behavior wasn't very ethical. And it likely led to a decrease in its stock price. I'd be interested in hearing some examples of that from you. I'm sure you can think of some besides what's in the textbook. To wrap up chapter 1, I would really like you to watch this concept clip. It is associated with the chapter 1 video reviews. The concept clip is called Shareholders and Stakeholders, and I think it will help to make clear how a firm tries to balance its shareholder interests and that of society, as well as its responsibilities to its different stakeholders.